May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rains fall softly upon your fields. And until we meet again, may you be held in the palm of God's hand. This, the Irish blessing, was the farewell given to Sister Beth Cowthorpe when she left Mount Lilydale College in 1989 after 14 years, during which time the small boarding school for girls changed to become a co-educational college, which she described as the jewel in the crown.
Following her years at Mount Lilydale, Sister Beth was principal of the Academy of Mary Immaculate in Fitzroy and Our Lady of Mercy, Heidelberg. In 1986, when the Mercy Schools Council was formed, she was appointed chair and is currently Canonical Administrator of Mary Mead College, South Morang, and Colby Catholic College, Green Lakes. It's a pleasure today to interview Sister Beth and document her journey during those 14 years. Welcome, Sister Beth.
Yes, it's nice to be here.
And thank you for agreeing to share memories of those years you spent at Mount Lilydale Mercy College. As a relatively young woman, you were teaching science at Coburg, and I believe you received a letter from the Provincial of the Sisters of Mercy suggesting you take on a new role here at Mount Lilydale. Would you like to tell us the contents of that letter and how you felt about the task set?
Well, it's very hard to explain because in religious life you just do as you're told. And while I not always did as I told, I couldn't get out of this one. I had decided to not be a principal of a secondary school because I wanted to pursue my love for psychology and counselling. But this letter came saying that things had been unsuccessful with boys coming into a girls' school. They needed someone who was strong, organised, able to control the students, and would be essential at this time to have someone like that. I was disappointed about it, but since I had a vow of obedience, there was no way I could change what I was doing. So it was a matter of doing what you were told, which sometimes it's always good. And as I look back over the years, I can say that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because I would have gone mad just doing counselling for people. Whereas with this, I've been able to do that, but within a different focus and a different way. So as I was driving down this morning, I thought of all the wonderful things that have been part of my life because I started with this.
The college was established in 1896, and we are fortunate to still have the initial building, and this interview is being conducted in what was the former chapel. You talked a lot about the importance of the Sisters of Mercy in the education here at Lilydale. Would you care to tell us about the Mercy ethos and how you set up that philosophy here at Mount Lilydale?
Well, there was really some understanding of the ethos, but you have to remember that it wasn't until that period of time that it became a phase that most religious orders were doing, were trying to get their ethos through to the girls. So it was something which most people were looking at, but it took time to actually educate the staff, as you know, because to them it was a Catholic school, but this was a Catholic school based on all the values and the love of a person who, through her short time, had covered the world with the whole idea that Catherine Macaulay was someone that we should use as our guide. And so that's how it went then. How did I do it? I suppose I did it simply by starting a whole lot of what you would call PD, professional development, but they were really small times when we'd invite someone to come and talk to the staff. I talked to the staff at times about it and made the emphasis on the fact that our life was centred on the works of Catherine Macaulay, compassion and understanding, and the development of the young, particularly young women. But we had boys too, so we did a bit about that as well.
The local parishes had been asked to consider funding a co-educational college in this area, given there was no opportunity for boys closer than Ringwood. But when that didn't proceed, the Sisters of Mercy agreed to take on co-education here. This was quite a revolutionary thing for the Sisters of Mercy, given they only had schools for the education of ladies in Melbourne. So how was this challenge met by the order?
Once I arrived, I knew then that we had to do a number of things. You don't connect boys coming from a single-sex school and girls in a single-sex school to think that they will just form, a happy place. There were a couple of things that were the problem. One, we had too many female teachers. And many of those were older and so didn't know how to deal with boys. The second thing was there were less boys than there were girls, and so you can imagine when in the year 11 and 12 or leaving a matric, you had a half a dozen boys and about 3 times or 4 times as many girls. They certainly would enjoy themselves, I'm sure. So what I had to do was to decide what you could do. Well, number one, we had to get more male teachers, and we also had to get some younger staff because there were the older staff members were good in certain areas, but they weren't able to cope. And if you were involved in that, you realise that too. The other thing too was to look at the way we could get the boys to, in a sense, integrate into the school, still knowing that they could be boys. So that's when I set up the single-sex classes at year 7 and 8. I can remember having all the staff come together. It was only a smaller staff at that time, about 350 students were there. And I had a meeting at the end of the year, not quite the end of the year, must have been the 3rd term, and told them that this was going to happen. We would have single-sex 7 and 8, and if they didn't like it, they could resign. I don't know what they thought, but I left the meeting at that point. So they were the two of the strategies that had to be looked at. And over the next 5 or 6 years, we did increase the number of male teachers, increase to the number of younger generation of teachers that coming in. And that was able to be done because the school was growing. Yes, in 1986 to 1990, the accepted enrolments, as agreed, were increasing, in that we had a maximum of 240 at year 7 in 1986. So that was about 9 years. So that it was. I did believe that it would take at least 9 or 10 years to get what we wanted. And because of that, although it was normal that our sisters only had principalship in a school for 6 years and then they were moved elsewhere, no one was was interested in coming to Lilydale, so I had it, and I would have been there for 20 years, only there was a change of congregation leaders who thought that perhaps it might be better that I move. So they were the main things, but that has to be linked with the curriculum, because we had to set up a curriculum for both boys and girls. And at the same time, the primary school was phasing out, so we also had to make sure that as they moved out, they realised that they were in another environment to what they had under their great teacher of Lee at that time. You know, she was able to do it, and then she did so much work when she turned into looking after the junior secondary part there.
Over the 14 years of co-education, you relied heavily on Kevin Farrelly as your deputy. You had Terry Harrison as a member of your executive, and you appointed Leah Hill and Glenys Heath as senior administrators. How much do you think you were dependent on colleagues like Kevin and Leah and Terry?
Well, that was another task that had to be done. We had to have leadership, and we also had to have consultative leadership, and that people would work together. It was, at that period of time, there were, certainly in our secondary schools, you did not have such things as a staff handbook. You might have in some of the very expensive schools, but to my knowledge, that didn't exist in our Mercy schools. And so I started setting up what you would call a way to make leadership work. And this certainly worked. And that's why we had different people. Females, why would you have females when you had a good female principal? Yeah, it was an ongoing thing, because as I said, it took more than 10 years to get what we really wanted. I can remember getting Glenys Heath and Leah Hill together at one stage, because they were able to work together. And I said, well, I'm going to separate the skill structure so that you have the 7 and 8 and then 9 to 12. And so I asked both of them, and I can still remember this. So we were on retreat, and I was sitting on the side of the bed talking to Glenys, and I said, I'd like to appoint you as a coordinator or the senior mistress, that's right. And I talked to her about whether she could work with Leah and have a junior mistress, and they both said yes. So I wrote them a letter and put up their salary, and they were on a very good way. So that was, and then as with Kevin, we needed another man there in that, and that's when Terry Harrison applied for the position. So over time it took to do that, and also to set up the staff handbooks and all those things that just didn't exist.
As the college expanded and more buildings were required, would you care to tell us something about how you explored the option of being able to fund both those buildings and the numerous lay teachers you had employed, given there was no longer sisters doing it for nothing? Maybe you might like to tell us of the selling of the bus to pay the lay teachers?
I can't really remember that one, but all I know is that when I took over, I was not responsible for the finance until the end of the year, although it happened in the third term. And then when I found the finances, we didn't have anything. And so I had to work out a way to get some money so we could pay our bills and pay the salaries. I remember that year it might have been the second year, that I told staff that they wouldn't get for their salary right to the end of January when they came back to school, because we didn't have it in the account. So I thought, well, we'll pay what they're up to and up until the beginning of January, and then in mid-January we'd pay the rest, something like that. So they were happy with that. I don't know why. I told them why, I think, in the sense I said, well, you'll have some new money come in after you've spent it all over Christmas. And it was then that I realised that our monies for the grants, whether it was our grants allocation group or whether it was for loans, it all has to go through the CEO. And one of the things they did was, when they got the last amount from the government for the school year, rather than issued it to the schools in December, they left it so they gained some interest, and then they put it in January. So they've profited by it, and we, in a sense, did profit by it and having it then in the January, and that's when I was able to keep that going, and we were able to manage our staff salaries.
Sister Beth, you were very successful in incorporating and involving parents in the developing college. You set up the advisory council, the college board. Major decisions regarding finance, building developments and curriculum were brought before the board, discussed at length.
Well, not at great length. Yes, they were discussed, but I'm afraid sometimes I'm not manipulative, but I'd always have 2 or 3 options, because it's no good presenting something that you want, because that makes them then look at it and find all the problems in it, right? So if you give someone 3 options, they'll always look to one, and with a bit of luck, your one will be the one.
And that's how you worked with the Ladies Auxiliary and
Yes,
the clothing company?
Yes, I'd get them to come up with something, and then if there was a confusion amongst some of them, well, then we'd work on that same thing. Well, all right, well, there's a couple of things here, which one will we do? You have to do that, because people don't like being presented with something to discuss, and because then they come in with all their alternative things, whereas if you have those alternative things, you soon find out who wants them, and then bit by bit you get what you want.
In an excerpt taken from Adrian Riley's A Century of Mercy, you wrote, "Perhaps one of the greatest lessons I learnt on coming to Lilydale was that things do take time, God's time. Despite the many difficulties, becoming co-educational, extending the buildings, finding money, enrolling students until we seemed to overflow, commencing the reorganisation of the school and staff structure, I believe that the college, staff and students grew to a greater understanding of their identity and purpose." How would you define that identity and purpose?
Each person has their own identity, but in order to make that identity something that is real, you need to look at faith. And if you start then to believe in yourself and to believe in faith, you're coordinating the growth within you. And that's the only way. And unfortunately today, people only think of themselves as a self, it's their self. And they don't look at what other things that are part of themselves that haven't developed because they haven't faith in their parents, teachers, in saying to them, you know, you could do this.
When you took over as principal, you appointed Jan Battolini as your PA. They were wonderful years. For 14 years you worked together with Jan, and she was a great support for you. We are fortunate that Jan, who volunteers at the College Heritage Centre, has joined us today. Hello, Jan.
Hi, Patricia.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
Good to see you again.
Do you know, I can still remember the day I started here. I was working in Lilydale as a secretary, and I wanted to change employment. And I had a son here in Year 8 and 2 in primary school at St Patrick's. So I rang up Joy Munro just to see whether there might be any vacancies. So I came up for an interview and I met you. And I was offered a position in the general office. Then shortly after that, you made the offer to me to be your secretary. So I was thrilled because it's what I really wanted to do. I remember telling a couple of teachers how excited I was, and they looked at me with a twinkle in their eye and said, well, I hope you're up for the challenge. And that started 14 wonderful years of working with you. I loved working at the college, and the college was a great group of staff under your helm. It was really friendly. It really felt like a home at Lilydale. I loved it. Sister Beth, I've got great respect for you, for working with you for all those 14 years. Your sense of humour, your warmth, your dedication to your job, your sense of gratitude for a job well done, and your vision. And talking about a gratitude well done, 2 things stick in my mind from the time I was there. That at the end of every night, when I'd come and say good night, you always thanked me for the day's work that I'd done, and always went home feeling appreciated. It was nice to be able to thank you for your work. And another thing that I've got a special memory of is at the start of every year, I'd received a letter from you, typed by you, a few little mistakes, but it was typed by you, thanking me for the last year and looking forward to working with me for the next year. So I'd start off every year really looking forward to it. So there were a few challenges along the way, but I would say I embraced all those challenges because I did love working with you.
Remember when we went down to the bottom room, you know?
Yes, the building there.
The building there, and people would want to come in, and you'd say no, and I'd hear, and I'd say, yes, I want that one.
Well, do you know, I used to have a barometer. They'd come in out of 10. The teacher would pop in there. Look, I want to ask for a week off. What do you reckon the barometer is? I'd say, it's a 6 today. Oh, I'll come back. That went on for years. And if it was above 8, all right, I'd make an appointment. But if they thought they should wait another week because you had a lot of pressure on and it wasn't the right time, they'd get a 3 or a 4 and we'd make an appointment.
Oh dear.
But it was that personal touch that was great.
Well, you were excellent. Otherwise, you wouldn't have stayed for 14 years. You were a great help, and I knew that even when things went bad and I had to tell someone that they need to go, you were there to support them in a way and support me. You were able to do both, which is good.
I remember once you described yourself as a benevolent dictator, Beth. Would you care to expand on your notion of what a benevolent dictator was?
Over my time, I've been given the tasks that no one else can do. And they say it was because I'm strong and demanding, and some would call it a dictator. But at the other part of me, I think that I'm conscious of the needs of all people, and so I try to, do one and the other. I don't know whether I told you this story. Last year I was sitting having a coffee, and I was sitting there reading the paper, and this woman came up. She was a biggish woman, and she had one child in her arm, and the little boy was running around, and she said, Sister Beth. And I said, yes, I don't. Who is it? And she said, you'd remember me. And I said, yes, who is it? And so she told me the name, and I said, oh yes. And I wasn't quite sure. And then she said, I had a dream last night that I met you. And I said, what? And she said, well, I had a dream when I couldn't go to sleep. And she said, I met you, and I can remember the time when my brother had died, a younger brother, and I came into your office to tell you about it. You took my hand and you held it on to me and calmed me down. And she said, I always remember that hand. And I couldn't remember much of it. And with that, a little old lady came over, and she had the child. She said, Mum, this is Sister Beth. And then there was just all this radiance and that. And those things, do happen. When we had the 40 years, for the past pupils, they all came. And the two guys came up to me, because they were in their 50s at that stage, and said, Sister Beth, do you remember me? And I looked at him and I said, no, I can't. And I said, tell me who you are. And so he told me a name, and then I thought, oh, gee. And I said, oh, yes, I do. I said, and I thought in an instant, he must have a sister. I said, how's your sister? Oh, she's well. And I thought, well, I got out of that one. So that was good. Then this other guy was standing there, and he said, do you remember me? And I said, no, look, I'm sorry, I can't. And he said, you can't remember me? And I said, no. I said, when did you start? He said, I started before you came in the first year. And he said, I didn't want to go back again because it was terrible. And I told my father, I'm not going back to school. And he made me come that first day. And he said, I came up to you and I told you I didn't want to be here. And do you know what you said? And I said, no. You said, well, go home. So he said, I went home. And this is my first year back, 40 years later. So that might tell you about my benevolent dictator. There's two sides to everything.
You talked about some staff are still here whom you employed way back. How do memories of those staff that you employed and worked with during that period, how do they impact on your ongoing journey?
Over time, I think I had a relationship with them, which it wasn't one that they were better than this one. So it gives me great delight when I hear that someone's been doing something or this or that.
In 2012, you were nominated by Peter Molinari and Gail Preston to the inaugural Mount Lilydale Mercy College Old Collegians Honour Roll. On the same night, others inducted were Sister Carol Terpstra, Provincial of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart and now living in the Philippines, the Honourable James Molino, Deputy Leader of the Government, Peter Anderson, whose struggle with motor neurone was a marvellous witness for all of us, and Dr. Julia Harrison, daughter of Terry Harrison, whom you had employed as your DP in charge of curriculum. What were your feelings that night when you were inducted?
Oh, I was surprised in some ways because I was a dictator. I was pleased to, and I've got the thing up on my desk at home there. It was nice to be recognised as you have achieved something.
Did you have a sense that you had helped create something special?
Not to the extent that it has come to because in a sense in that I finished on a high, but within that first 6 months that I was glad that I wasn't there, because the way things were and people were reacting to, and when a new principal comes in, and that always happens, and I learnt from that you should never stay more than 9 or 10 years or 8 years at a school, because whoever comes in after you finds it difficult.
How significant is it for you that your life journey has interwoven with women and men who have made a difference in the world?
What you were working for was that these would have the education and the ability and the faith to live their life. I think I've always worked on that everyone has different gifts, and that's one of the things that I would work on with staff too. If they can't do something or they're not succeeding, you look and see what could they do. When you hear of a student or someone, and people meet you. I was somewhere the other day, and this guy, he had a big, he was talking. I was talking to a group, and he came over and he said, "Oh, it's Beth, is it?" I said, "Yes," and then he said, "You know, we were on the CDF board together." And I said, "Oh yes, that's right, so that we were." Then he told me, I can't remember who it was his daughter, I think, that went to academy there, and so, that came back. So you see and you meet people that have been part of your life, and you walk away thinking, well, they're doing well. But unfortunately, there are some that haven't done well, and they're the ones that often contact me and ask, can you get me a job? And you can get some, but not always nowadays.
It's been a privilege to talk with you today, Sister Beth, and on behalf of all who have been part of the Mount Lilydale College community, thank you.
Well, after 60 years of teaching and being with schools, I've come to the stage where I think that it's time that I give up. But every time I suggest that, someone says, "No, will you do this, please?" So when I turn 80 next year, I hope that will be the time when I finish. That's in the middle of the year.
June,
that's right.
Oh, I hope we're all being invited to the party.
Are we having a party?
I pray that you will rejoice always, pray often, and in all things give thanks to God. And may He bless you in time and eternity.